Welcome to Flying Talkers broadcast. I'm glad you're here. American Airlines is marking its 100th year, and anniversaries like this are a good excuse to do something we don't always take time to do in aviation. Stop, look around, and ask who actually built the version of the company we recognize today. Not just the brand, not just the route map, but the operating philosophy and the competitive posture. And that brings us to a name that still shows up in very literal, very physical ways. Robert L. Crandall. If you've ever been out to American's headquarters in Fort Worth near DFW, you've probably seen the words for yourself. The American Airlines Robert L. Crandall campus. It's not a small dedication plaque tucked into a hallway. It's a massive, multi-building home base, hundreds of acres, an enormous investment, and thousands of employees working day to day under a name that's become part of the landscape. So the obvious question is the one that matters. What do you have to do in this industry to get your name on something that big? The answer, in short, is that Crandall became the defining modern-era leader for American Airlines across the 1980s and into the 1990s. His impact wasn't about one clever move. It was about a long run of strategy, discipline, and decisions that were sometimes unpopular in the moment, but aimed at keeping an airline strong in a business that rarely rewards hesitation. What you're hearing today is built as a kind of time capsule. The core perspective comes from a story our editor Richard Malkin put together back in September of 2015. Dusting it off now, during the centennial, isn't about nostalgia for nostalgia's sake. It's a reminder that iconic companies don't just happen. They're the result of people making hard calls at the right time and having the nerve to follow through. Before we jump into that 2015 perspective, a quick word about the sponsor that helps make this program possible.
Today's program is brought to you by ATC Aviation Services. One world, one great general sales and services GSSA for air cargo. ATC's mission, as CEO Ingo Zimmer puts it, is to be the leading cargo GSSA in the world, built on the experience and expertise of a carefully selected team of air cargo management specialists. Their vision is to expand across the globe while setting high standards for service quality and transparency. ATC focuses on professionally growing partner airlines while serving mutual customers at the highest level. And more leading airlines worldwide continue to choose ATC as their GSA and GSSA partner. For the full story, visit www.atc-aviation.com and tell them Flying Talkers sent you.
Now, back to Robert Crandall. Richard Malkin's connection to this story starts with a moment that sounds small at first. He was in Fort Worth, working through a couple of cargo-related issues during the period when George Shipman was leading American's cargo effort. In the middle of that, Crandall, then the president, stopped in briefly. Not for a long meeting, not for a formal speech. Just long enough, though, to deliver an upbeat, confident picture of where AA Cargo stood and where it was headed. And then, almost immediately, reality arrived with the kind of headline that reminds you how unforgiving airline economics can be. Within a week, American made national news by grounding its transcontinental freighter system. The reasoning was straightforward. The market couldn't sustain two parallel cargo businesses at the same time, one built around dedicated freighters and another that could move freight in the belly space underneath passengers. When the numbers don't work, the numbers don't work. That decision sparked protests, especially from heavy shippers who depended on those all-cargo flights. One industry observer, Julius B. Hupersmith of Container Corporation, criticized the move with an old saying about trying to chase two hares with one dog. But even he acknowledged the deeper point. Business doesn't always follow the neat proverb. Or as Ben Franklin put it, you've got to drive your business, or it'll drive you. That moment matters because it hints at a theme Crandall returned to again and again. Aviation is always interesting and often brutal. The decisions can be complicated, but they're rarely optional. By 2015, Crandall had been retired for about 17 years as chairman and CEO of AMR Corporation and American Airlines. But he wasn't silent. He spoke as part of the Wings Club Foundation's Harold Harris Lecture Series, and he didn't come to reminisce. He came to evaluate what had changed and what, in his view, stubbornly hadn't. A bit of background. Crandall was born in Westerly, Rhode Island, and graduated from Wharton in 1960. When he looked at the industry from the vantage point of 2015, The biggest shift he pointed to was the one many people had predicted for years: consolidation. What used to be a constant dogfight among many major carriers had narrowed into a market dominated by a handful of giants. In his framing, the era of non-stop, bare-knuckle brawls after deregulation had cooled, and the balance of power had shifted. With fewer big players, the industry looked more like a seller's market than the chaotic battlefield it had been. But if consolidation was the headline change, Crandall's bigger point was that the heart of the airline business remained the same. Airlines, he argued, are still uniquely capital-intensive, labor-intensive, and fuel-intensive, and they operate inside a national airspace system controlled by the FAA, meaning airlines are particularly exposed to political gridlock and shifting priorities in Washington. Would consolidation continue? Crandall thought it probably would, because the economics had been favorable. And beyond consolidation, he expected another force to accelerate: automation. More automated tools, more techniques to reduce costs, and more technology intended to make the customer experience smoother. But here's where his warning comes in. Crandall wasn't impressed by progress for its own sake. He argued that if the industry didn't keep moving on three fronts: growth, consolidation, and automation, then a set of chronic problems would stay unsolved. And he listed them plainly: unhappy customers, unstable and inadequate funding, an outdated airspace system, airports that are falling behind, and a security regime that's intrusive and expensive. He also pointed to another major issue that would require proactive thinking: unfair international competition. Let's talk about customers for a moment, because Crandall didn't sugarcoat it. In his view, many airline customers were deeply dissatisfied. He cited the American Customer Satisfaction Index, where airlines were ranked near the bottom compared with other industries. And he ticked through the complaints that any frequent traveler could recite from memory: indifferent service, surprise fees, delays and cancellations, tight seating, lost or delayed baggage, weakened frequent flyer value, fewer options, and poor complaint handling. Then he made a statement that's uncomfortable, but rings true. He said he doubted customers would ever think as highly of airlines as airlines think customers should. In other words, the gap between what carriers believe they provide and what passengers feel they receive can be stubbornly wide. Crandall also acknowledged the reality sitting underneath many of those pain points: price. Whether you're shipping cargo or buying a coach seat, price drives decisions. And when price is the primary battleground, airlines respond in predictable ways, like adding more seats to airplanes to lower unit costs. But he didn't accept the idea that cheap automatically has to mean miserable. His argument was that even if travelers prioritize price, technology can still make flying more pleasant and more efficient. He pointed to in-flight connectivity as an example. At the time, connectivity was spreading across domestic fleets and beginning to show up internationally. The problem, he said, was that early systems were often too slow to create the kind of value passengers imagined, and too limited to transform how crews and airlines operated. Crandall believed that bandwidth and satellite advances were about to change that. Faster connections wouldn't just mean more entertainment for passengers. They could help crews serve customers better and give airlines improved real-time insight into aircraft performance. And the downstream benefits he anticipated were exactly what airlines chase: fewer delays, lower costs, and higher satisfaction. But he didn't see technology as the only lever. He also proposed something that tends to get less airtime: rethink the balance between outsourcing, labor, and capital. In simple terms, he suggested pulling back from some outsourcing and placing a bit more cash flow into labor, while dialing capital spending down slightly. In his view, that could pay off in public approval as well as in employee and customer experience. Then he offered a statistic designed to jolt the room. He compared flight times from the dawn of the jet age to modern block times. In 1959, when American scheduled its first transcontinental Boeing 707 flight between Los Angeles and New York, the westbound block time was 4 hours and 45 minutes, and eastbound was 4 hours. By 2015, those scheduled times had stretched dramatically, more than a 30% deterioration. Crandall said he couldn't perfectly separate how much of that was fuel-saving slower speeds versus congestion in the airways and on runways. But he was confident about the takeaway. Reducing congestion would deliver a major financial and environmental return on investment. And that leads into his frustrations with the pace of reform. He argued there were common-sense steps available, but too many interests refused to compromise for the broader good. He criticized both industry positions and a Congress that often seemed afraid to upset anyone. He referenced calls from leaders like House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee Chairman Bill Schuster to ignore petty politics and support transformational air traffic management legislation. Crandall pushed strongly for accelerating progress toward next-gen-style air traffic modernization. And he went further. He advocated separating air traffic control from the FAA and establishing a self-supporting corporation to run it. Of course, he acknowledged that such a move triggers big questions. How do you fund ATC? How do you fund the remaining FAA functions? What does governance look like for a new ATC entity? His view was that workable models existed, if the industry and government had the will to adopt them. Airport funding was another flashpoint. He discussed the Airport Improvement Program, roughly $3.5 billion annually, and the tug-of-war over how to pay for needed facilities. Airport operators had suggested giving up some AIP support in exchange for higher passenger facility charges. Airlines tended to prefer funding expansions through higher rents and landing fees instead. Crandall leaned toward the airport's position, pointing to studies suggesting higher PFCs and higher charges wouldn't necessarily meaningfully reduce travel demand. He also noted that many international airlines and ITA generally support the idea that travelers should bear facility charges. Still, he didn't argue for a blank check. He suggested what he considered a fair trade: allow higher PFCs, but build in protections so airlines aren't forced to bankroll airport grandiosity. Projects that look good on paper but don't deliver proportional value. Then came security, and Crandall's critique was sharp. He called out what he saw as the hassles and the costs, and argued that TSA had expanded massively while failing to seriously evaluate what wasn't working. He cited a workforce of more than 50,000 TSA employees operating across 450-plus airports, with a price tag around $7.5 billion a year for travelers and taxpayers. And he didn't stop at big numbers. He pointed to specific programs. Behavior detection officers, he noted, cost about $200 million a year. And he referenced a GAO report indicating that, despite spending close to $900 million since the program began, it had not been credited with stopping a single terrorist from getting into an airport or onto an airplane. He also highlighted the Air Marshal program. While the exact number of marshals is classified, he noted that they covered only a fraction of flights and produced very few arrests. His point wasn't that security doesn't matter. He viewed the mission as vital. His point was that the execution had become expensive and poorly validated. His recommendation to the industry was direct: push Congress to examine TSA hard and fix what's broken. Finally, Crandall shifted to a topic that remains a live wire: international competition and open skies. He argued that the United States should stop, in his words, handing aviation markets and aviation jobs to foreign airlines and service providers. And he framed it within a broader economic concern. You can't build a healthy consumer economy without healthy employment. He pointed to long-term labor participation and income trends, arguing that as income shifted away from labor and toward capital, household earnings stagnated and inequality grew. Within that context, he criticized how open skies agreements had often been pursued under the assumption that any deal labeled open skies must be in the national interest. Over a couple of decades, the U.S. signed agreements with well over 100 governments. Crandall said he never accepted the idea that every agreement automatically served U.S. carriers, and he argued that some deals were clearly damaging both at signing and afterward. He made his values clear: good jobs matter, and fair competition matters. Low prices are not the only measure of success if the playing field is tilted by subsidies and unequal rules. He pointed to the push by American, Delta, and United to present evidence that certain state-backed Gulf carriers received substantial government support that, in this view, made competition fundamentally uneven. He also emphasized differences in labor protections between the U.S. and some competitor nations. Crandall rejected the idea that U.S. airlines were simply asking for protection. His claim was that the industry was asking for enforcement of fairness, and he warned that if the trend continued, U.S. carriers could ultimately be pushed off certain international routes. His closing message on this point was forceful: end the charade, and take a careful, comprehensive look at open skies agreements and how they're being applied. So what does this time capsule from 2015 give us in a centennial year? It gives us a reminder of the mindset that made Robert Crandall such a consequential figure. He looked at aviation as a system: customers, labor, technology, air traffic management, airports, security, and global competition. He was willing to say that customers weren't happy, willing to say congestion was costing everyone, willing to say the funding structures were outdated, willing to say parts of security spending weren't justified, and willing to say that global agreements only work when the rules are enforced evenly. You don't have to agree with every position he took to see why his name is on that Fort Worth campus. Leaders who leave lasting marks on airlines are the ones who wrestle with the whole machine, not just the quarterly numbers. That's Flying Talkers broadcast for today. We took a ride back to 2015, and in a lot of ways, we flew right back into questions the industry is still trying to answer now. Thanks to Richard Malkin for the original work that inspired this revisit, and thank you for spending your time with me. Until next time. And good night, Joe, wherever you are.